Well, that was pretty stimulating stuff that Bill has laid on us, huh, Sari?
Big time.
I don't know about you, but I sure had a number of things that I had to just scribble down while we were going through that, where I either want to hear more or it made me think of other kinds of connections. And I guess sort of starting with the first talk, but it's kind of a theme that continues throughout. So, of course, there's the dramatic video of the mice, and we got to talk about those mice and the optogenetics in action. That study, the Hong et al. 2015. So, right, I mean, we get this sort of light through the to the amygdala of these poor of this mouse, and it freaks out. But Bill gave us this sort of question about how could we use that kind of technology looking down the road in therapeutic kinds of ways. And what that made me wonder was, how much are we actually already doing that? Not, of course, with hitting people with light in certain part of their brain that's been genetically engineered, but how is it that maybe in the history of the church or in various kinds of spiritual disciplines, we've actually tripped upon techniques for helping us in what he then calls top-down kind of ways in the second talk, actually kind of push the buttons of certain parts of the brain. That is, we've trained up certain kind of activation of certain kinds of neurostructures through these different kinds of, say, spiritual disciplines. And maybe the neuroscience, as it advances, and he gave us great optimism in that first talk of how it might advance, could actually help us understand those disciplines better from a neuroscientific point of view, so that maybe we could also know when they are likely to work, when they're not, what their dark shadow sides are, and so forth. At least that was one thing that sort of struck me initially in that first talk. But that's just me. I mean,
Yeah, definitely. It made me feel, the first talk just made me feel like we are just at the cusp of really understanding anything about the brain. Like we're just like you said that. Well, like you said, there's great optimism in the field because these challenges that we used to not have access to, we now have access to seeing the maps and the dynamics of different signals and whatnot. And that poor zebra fish, God bless its little soul stuck in the jelly. Those barriers are, yeah. Those barriers are coming down. So, I mean, I feel like a few years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we'll have a lot more insight as to what sort of practical applications there are here. But it made me think a lot about the free will versus determinism sort of debates, and rather than talk about what is the case, because it seems clear that it is a combination of forces outside your control and sources within your control. But when you're talking to when you're making moral decisions about how you treat and deal with others, it seems like the better position to have is that to think of them as having little free will. I don't know, sometimes that's not the case, but to give people grace and the benefit of the doubt that maybe they didn't have their lunch today. Maybe they need to eat a sandwich or whatever.
Right.
But then with yourself, thinking of yourself as a totally free agent who has the freedom to make moral decisions, and is whatever forces are influencing your behavior, it seems like having a sense of your own agency and freedom is healthier for your thriving. I don't know. That's just one of the things I was thinking about.
Yeah, actually, what you've just said touches on, sort of one of these textbook standard kinds of findings in psychology. It's called the fundamental attribution error. There are some cross-cultural wrinkles on this, but the basic idea is we're really good at contextualizing our own, especially failures. Oh, well, I was hangry is why I snapped at so-and-so, or I was stressed, or whatever it is. And so we are kind of aware of these kinds of contextual factors when it's us. But when we're judging other people's behavior, it's because there's something fundamentally wrong with them, right? We don't contextualize the same way. That person cut me off because they're a bad driver or they're a jerk, not because they're on their way to the hospital and they've got somebody bleeding out in the back seat. We often don't go there. And in some ways you're pointing to that then our awareness of this sort of neuroscientific and psychological science findings on this moral decision making and impulse control and all of these other kinds of things should give us another, well, should help us regulate. We're even more guilty of the fundamental attribution error, right? I mean, oh no, there are more contextual factors that we haven't considered.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and there's a million theological questions that go along with this conversation. Like, how do we think of the function of the brain and the bottom up and top down factors as it relates to sin and things like that? And it sort of makes me more inclined to think of, you know, not, I don't know, less in moral terms and more in terms of health. And I know that maybe like a healthy person or a less healthy person versus a good or a bad person, or and what does that say about God's saving work in a person's life, making them, empowering them to have greater agency over those factors that maybe limited their agency. I'm sure our more philosophically minded people will have a field day with the conversation around freedom.
Yeah.
I'm almost scared for Bill, and you know, and when people get into that, the definition of freedom, but he said becoming free is a lifelong process, and a religious community can be a powerful force in increasing that freedom. I just thought that was a really powerful statement, and I can't wait to see how our cohort kind of takes that apart, that process of becoming free. Yeah. And what about the real life examples we see where it seems like people are just never able to do that, despite, you know, I don't know, a lot of positive factors, or I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think I got excited about similar parts of his presentation there. I think also because they connect with some of the themes that we talked about in earlier seminars too, in the TheoPsych program. So one of the things we've talked about previously is how humans, amongst all of these other animal species, have these really huge foreheads, right? I mean, that one of the things that's obvious if you look at sort of brain evolution is not only do we have big brains for the size of our bodies, but especially the sort of prefrontal cortex kind of stuff. And Bill pointed us to, that's the area that's been especially implicated in what we might call top-down influences. And so it's almost like we've evolved to become an animal that has this unusual gift that it can exercise top-down control, which then frees it. It gives it the ability to exercise freedom that other animals can't. I mean, we don't need to go back to his colonoscopy, but it vividly makes the point. No other animal would choose that. Less sort of crazy and disturbing, other animals, apparently mammals, won't eat chili peppers. And well, I mean, come on, Mexican food without chili peppers, that's just sad. So God's common grace to us gives us the ability to eat chili peppers and enjoy Mexican food. But then, sorry, theologians, but I really, I too am captivated by that idea that from Bill's kind of perspective, then we see that having the special kind of brain or nature that we have gives us tools for addressing the sort of more, it's almost, I hate to dichotomize, so I don't want to, but it's that other aspect of our nature that really seems like it's broken a lot of the time, though Bill nuanced this properly, right? But it's these impulses that can be wild and inappropriate, and yet we've got these executive functions that enable us at least to manage those in some ways. But then we need examples. Then I think you nailed it, right? A community, a church, right? Then is a gift to us to help socialize those kinds of those top-down influences, right? Jesus's example gives us both a model and an inspiration to say, no, we can do better than these impulses, these heuristics, these biases. Because they're not all bad, but they're not all good all the time. And we need some way of seeing the difference. So, gee, it just feels like there's all kinds of interesting intersection points here between the theology, especially maybe even ecclesiology, areas of theology and the sanctification process, and what's coming out of these sciences.
I was going to say, I have been thinking a lot lately about when, like, so freedom is not coerced choices. And everybody agrees with that. If someone's controlling you or, you know, coercing you, that's bad. That's not good. So, but what on sort of the spectrum of influence to control, when does it become like nefarious or exploitive? And that's sort of a question, a theological question, if you apply that to the work of the Spirit and God. Like, how does God work? How does God work in the world? You know, even people like, you know, our friend Tom Ord or whatever, who has a very limited view of the way that God interacts with the world, thinks that there's a sort of a lull, like a gentle, like, come this way, guys, you know, like to God just, you know, lulling us towards, calling us towards the good, you know. So, but at what point does like divine interference, like what would we say, oh no, God doesn't do it that way because that would be coercion, or I don't know. And then you have people from the Reformed perspective that have a much higher idea of how God interacts with the world or determines what happens. And then, you know, obviously everything in between. So I don't know. That's just
yeah, or even from
probably a
more
can of worms.
Yeah, I bet. But that's what we're here for. Let's open the worms and let our participants try to corral these things. That's not the right metaphor. You don't corral worms. You made me think, you know, from a Pentecostal or, you know, charismatic perspective too, there are interesting issues about how much the Holy Spirit is a bottom-up influence or a top-down influence. Does our relationship with the Holy Spirit and cultivating that then change with regard to these kinds of analytic categories that Bill has offered to us? He sure has given us a lot to talk about.
For sure.
And so I'm really looking forward to the conversations.